The courtroom was unusually quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that felt heavy, almost like the air itself knew something important was about to happen. I sat in my usual seat near the back, scribbling notes for the story I was covering. Cases like this, involving children, always carried a weight that lingered long after you left the courthouse. Today's case was about a young boy, no older than 8 or 9. His name was Jamal. He was small for his age, with a mess of curly hair that looked like it hadn't seen a comb in weeks. But it was his eyes that caught everyone's attention. Big, brown, and filled with a kind of sadness that no child should ever have to carry. Jamal had been in foster care for years. His file was thick with stories of bouncing from one home to another, never staying long enough to unpack fully. Some families couldn't handle his nightmares. Others struggled with his quiet, withdrawn nature. Whatever the reason, Jamal had been passed along like a package no one knew where to send. Today, he sat at a table beside his lawyer, his small hands gripping the edge as if he was trying to anchor himself in place. Across the room was Judge Carter, a woman with a reputation for being firm but fair. She was known for her no-nonsense approach, yet there was something warm about her, a softness in her voice, a kindness in her eyes that drew people in. The case was about determining Jamal's next placement. Another home, another set of strangers. But as the judge began to speak, I noticed Jamal's gaze wasn't on her papers or her gavel. He wasn't even looking at the lawyer whispering in his ear. His eyes were locked on Judge Carter herself, as if she were the only person in the room. The hearing went on for what felt like hours. Social workers gave reports, lawyers argued their points, and the judge asked her usual pointed questions. But through it all, Jamal sat quietly, his gaze never leaving Judge Carter. Finally, it was his turn to speak. His lawyer leaned over, whispering instructions, but Jamal didn't seem to hear. Instead, he stood, his small frame trembling slightly, and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," he began, his voice soft but steady. "Can I ask you something?" The courtroom stilled. Even Judge Carter paused, her pen hovering over her notes. "Of course, Jamal," she said gently. "You can ask me anything." Jamal took a deep breath, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his too big sweater. Do you think I'm hard to love?" The question hung in the air, heavy and heartbreaking. I heard someone behind me gasp softly, and I wasn't sure if it was a lawyer, a social worker, or maybe even myself. Judge Carter's expression softened, the firm lines of her face giving way to something that looked a lot like sorrow. "Jamal," she said after a moment, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "Why would you ask that?" He shrugged, his eyes darting to the floor. "'Cause no one ever stays. They always say it's not my fault, but then they leave anyway." He looked up at her again, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I just want to know if maybe something's wrong with me." Judge Carter sat back in her chair, visibly moved. She took a moment to compose herself before leaning forward, her voice calm but filled with compassion. "Jamal, I want you to listen to me very carefully," she began. "There is nothing wrong with you, not one single thing. Do you understand me?" Jamal nodded hesitantly, but the doubt in his eyes remained. "Sometimes," she continued, "grown-ups don't always know how to handle their own feelings. They make mistakes, big ones. But those mistakes aren't about you. They're about them." For the first time, Jamal looked like he might believe her. But then, he did something no one expected. "Can I live with you?" he asked, his voice breaking. The room went silent. Judge Carter blinked, clearly taken aback. "Jamal," she began, her voice wavering. "You're nice," he said simply. "You talk to me like I matter, like I'm not just a problem to fix." He paused, looking down at his hands. "You feel like a mom." There it was. The words that brought the courtroom to its knees. The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see how Judge Carter would respond. For a moment, she just sat there, stunned. Her lips slightly parted, as if she couldn't quite find the words. But then, she cleared her throat and leaned forward, resting her hands gently on the desk in front of her. "Jamal," she said softly, her voice trembling just enough for those paying attention to notice. I don't know what to say. What you just said means more to me than you could ever imagine." Her eyes glistened, and she blinked quickly, trying to maintain her composure. "But being a judge means I have rules I have to follow. There are systems in place, and I can't just—" She stopped, her voice catching. She took a deep breath and tried again. "I can't just take you home with me, no matter how much I wish I could." Jamal's face fell, and for a moment he looked so small and defeated, it made my heart ache. "Oh," he whispered, his voice barely audible. But before anyone could say another word, Judge Carter stood. She pushed back her chair, walked around the bench, and knelt down in front of him so they were eye to eye. "Listen to me, Jamal," she said firmly, her hands resting lightly on his shoulders. "You deserve to have someone in your life who sees you the way I see you right now. Someone who loves you, fights for you, and never gives up on you. And I promise you this. I will do everything in my power to make sure you find that person. Do you hear me?" Jamal nodded. But the tears were spilling down his cheeks now, his small body trembling with quiet sobs. Judge Carter hesitated for a moment, then pulled him into her arms, holding him tightly. It wasn't the kind of moment you usually see in a courtroom. Judges are supposed to be impartial, detached. But in that moment, Judge Carter wasn't just a judge. She was a human being, and Jamal was a child who needed to know that someone cared. True to her word, Judge Carter didn't let Jamal's case slip through the cracks. She worked tirelessly, reaching out to every connection she had, determined to find him a home where he would feel safe and loved. But what no one in the courtroom knew that day was that Judge Carter went home and couldn't stop thinking about Jamal's question. His voice played on a loop in her mind. "Do you think I'm hard to love?" Weeks passed, and though the system churned on as it always did, something about Jamal's case was different. People whispered about it in the courthouse hallways. Social workers mentioned how involved the judge was, how she kept checking in, pushing for updates. Then, one day, the whispers turned into something more. It started with a simple announcement. Judge Carter had formally recused herself from Jamal's case, citing a personal conflict of interest. For those who understood the legal world, it was a clear sign something significant was happening. Not long after, the news broke. Judge Carter had filed to become Jamal's foster parent. The day Jamal found out, he was sitting in a room at the Child Services office, doodling on a piece of paper while a caseworker shuffled through a stack of files. When Judge Carter walked in, dressed in jeans and a sweater instead of her usual robes, he barely looked up. "Hey, Jamal," she said softly. He glanced at her, confused. "What are you doing here?" She knelt down beside him, just like she had that day in the courtroom. "I came to tell you something," she said. "Something important." Jamal put down his pencil, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What?" She took a deep breath, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I talked to some people, and they all agreed that I could be your foster mom, if that's something you want." For a moment, Jamal just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, his eyes filled with tears. "You mean it?" he whispered. "I mean it," she said, smiling through her own tears. "You asked me if you were hard to love, and I want you to know the answer is no. You're not hard to love, Jamal, not even a little bit." He didn't say anything. He just threw his arms around her neck, holding on as if he never wanted to let go. Months later, I sat in the same courtroom where it all began, but this time, the atmosphere was different. Lighter, happier. Jamal sat beside Judge Carter, his new mom, as the adoption papers were signed. When the judge declared it official, the room erupted into applause. Jamal grinned, looking up at her with an expression so full of joy it was impossible not to smile back. "Does this mean I get to call you Mom now?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. Judge Carter laughed, pulling him close. "You can call me whatever you want," she said. And as they walked out of the courtroom hand in hand, it was clear to everyone watching that this wasn't just the end of a case. It was the beginning of a story about love, family, and the power of never giving up on someone who just needs to be seen.